Carol Roth, the author of the book You Will Own Nothing, former investment banker. Carol, last Friday, I think it was, the jobs report came out. It was much lower than expected. And I started seeing things like Bank of America saying, we're in stagflation now. Are we? And if so, what is it and what does it mean?
Well, let's first talk about some of these data points, Glenn, and then we can go into stagflation. First, we've seen a couple of bad data points. And as we've talked about before, the data is garbage. So we're doing the best we can to interpret what it is that they're telling us without any sense of the, actual reality behind us. But we saw, before the jobs report that the first quarter GDP was down about 1% lower than expectations, down to 1.6% on an annualized basis. Then we get the April jobs report, and that is also down. It's the slowest job gain that we've seen in, I think, about 6 months, again, if you believe the data. And what that first is telling me is that all of this money that the government has spent to basically window dress the economy, to avoid the double dip recession, because remember, we did have a recession, 2 quarters of negative growth back in 22. Then we popped out of it and we sort of expected we might go down. But the government ran these massive deficits, about 2 times the historical average on a debt to GDP basis that we would normally see. And they tried to prop up the economy so it wouldn't show that we were in a recession at a very expensive cost, by the way. Normally when you have an expanding economy, you would see a shrinking deficit. They have done the opposite. They ran a big deficit to try to create this appearance. And with an interest rate financing that deficit, at the largest point in 15 years. Right. So we know that we are not getting a good return now on this window dressing, and it is not creating these amazing outcomes for the economy, on the GDP front, on the jobs front, which again could turn around. It's one set of data points which shift. Stagflation is something that I've talked to you about, I've been talking about for years as a very possible outcome here. And it's very much what it sounds like. It is when the economy stagnates, when you have, a low growth number, but at the same time, you have inflation. So you have sort of the worst of all worlds. You're not making gains in productivity. You're not making, gains in wages and things like that. The economy is just hanging out, but you get this long-term sticky inflation, which again, we said was very likely because the government continued to spend at these massive levels and they were working against what the Fed was trying to do to bring down inflation. So they are actually at this point a likely cause of long-term inflation because we have to continue to finance these massive deficits. And so that's the reality of this sticky situation. When you hear somebody like JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon saying, I'm worried that the economy is going to look more like the 1970s than anything else, this is something that they experienced at that period of time. And he's seeing those parallels, although we are in a much worse fiscal situation from a fiscal foundation standpoint than we were, strangely enough, in the 1970s.
Because of our deficit and debt.
Correct.
Yeah. So this means that jobs, everything just is the same. It doesn't get better. It could get worse, but it doesn't generally get better for the individual. And prices continue to go up, right? That's what stagflation is.
Yeah, you're not seeing your growth in wages. You're not seeing massive growth in companies. The economy just sort of putters along. You're not seeing the massive layoffs or things that you might see with a recession. Things are just kind of going along, but not really growing at all. And you're not seeing that light at the end of the tunnel. But at the same time, we're encountering that ongoing sticky inflation that we know destroys purchasing power and is really borne particularly by the middle and working class.
All right. So, Carol, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I have a couple of other things. But you said at the beginning of your conversation, you said, if you believe the numbers. I don't believe the numbers, but the only reason you change and fudge numbers is not to stop them from looking so good, but stop them from looking so bad. And the reason why I don't believe them is there's just too many times where they've been adjusted, and there's always adjustments, but not like it has in the last year or so. And there's just contradictory information. If you're somebody who's listening now and, you don't necessarily have that, you don't think that, the administration would go that far in fake numbers, what leads you to say if you believe these numbers?
Well, like you said, there have been a lot of anomalies in the numbers. And, if you kind of go back even further, we've changed the method of calculation of these numbers at the governmental level many times since the 1980s. One of the things that you have to remember for something, let's say like inflation, is that inflation feeds into things like cost of living adjustments, the amount that they have to increase Social Security payments by. So there is an actual reason why it is that they would want to suppress those numbers. Another piece of data, which I think is very important, is that entities and individuals no longer want to participate in government surveys. So we have seen an absolute massive decline in the participation of the data that is being collected by the government, which means when they don't have people and businesses responding, there are more biases in the data because it's a smaller subset of people who want to do it. And it means that they have to run it through their own adjustments and seasonal adjustments and their best guesses in the model.
Right.
Yeah, and it's garbage in, garbage out. You put bad data in, you're going to get bad data out. So there are a lot of things. This isn't just like hey, the numbers all were adjusted massively, or we've seen the same numbers over and over again, speaking to the bad data. That there are some real structural issues to why many of us don't think the data is sort of worth anything.
By the way, we're talking to J.D. Vance in about 15 minutes. Right now we're with Carol Roth talking about the economy. And I want to bring up something. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. It's an interview where they are trying to make the case for modern monetary theory, which is not modern. It's a very old theory. You can just print money and no big deal. Nothing bad will happen. And they talked to Joe Biden's economic advisor. Now, if you would, explain who Jared Bernstein is. He's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Joe Biden. But he's not just some schlub, right?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to opine on that piece, but what I will tell you is he's somebody that is very powerful economically. Yes. This is Joe Biden's right-hand advisor, who has been, by the way, since the Obama administration. He was Biden's advisor, and this is the guy who analyzes and interprets economic developments. He comes up with economic policies. He puts that forward to the president. He's been entrenched in think tanks. He's been a contributor to CNBC. He writes op-eds. He was a chief economist and economic advisor, previously. I mean, this guy is like, from the left and far left standpoint, one of the people who they hang their hat on to be the economic advisor. Right. And I don't know, are you going to play the clip? Because it is also one of the most painful things I've ever watched in my life.
I want to get your comment from it. And I just wanted to set up, this is a real player in the economy. This is somebody our government depends on. Listen to him try to explain our deficit and what's happening with our money. Listen.
The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do?
No.
They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to Yeah, I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Oh my God. Would you feel if that was your captain and you got onto a plane and he said, hey, we're going to be traveling at 4,000. How does this work again? Would you get on that plane?
Okay, so I'm going to be generous here first, Glenn, and then I'm going to be not so generous. The first generous thing I will say is that we've all been in the media for a very long time, you longer than me, and we've all had days that are somewhat like this where, we know something really well and we just can't get it out. So I'm going to, it could be today for me. There have been a few times when I just have made absolutely no sense on something that I know very well. So it does happen. That being said, now that I've been generous, again, this is sort of the chief architect of the U.S. economy at this point, going into a discussion about MMT. I call it magic money tree. I heard that somewhere along the line. Thought that was great. And their main thesis is, you can, you've got the checkbook, you can just write checks. So the question that he asked, which anyone who lives in Zimbabwe would probably know the answer to, why can't the government just print as much money as it wants? We all know it's highly inflationary. And we've been living through that, for the past few years. So that's the very short answer. Of course, there's nuance to this. Of course, there's wonkiness that we can go in and explain the Treasury and the Fed and that.
Really
but just
easy
a very
to explain.
simple, so it begs the question to me. Does he not know the answer? Or does he very much know the answer, but he doesn't feel like he could admit it and hasn't done the prep? Which again, these are politicians and politician mouthpieces. They should be able to kind of talk around it. That's what they do all the time. And I think the answer is that they are just entirely decoupled from reality. So they don't care. They don't care what it is, Glenn. Money is something very discrete, right? Money has three definitions. It is a unit of account, it's a medium of exchange, it's a store of value. But at the end of the day, putting that together, what is it? It is a proxy for productivity. It is an estimation of the labor that you have, because it used to be, if you were a farmer, you had apples, somebody who was a doctor at doctor services, you'd have to figure out that exchange. Now this creates something that's seamless. And so it stands for something.
Time is money.
It is. It is your output. And so if you do not have an increase in economic activity, an increase in productivity, and you put more dollars in the system, what are you doing? You're putting in more, proxies for productivity. They're chasing the same amount of goods and services. It means that those goods and services have been inflated in value because each one of those proxies are worth less. But the people, if you go to Congress right now and you ask them to give you that definition of money that I just gave you, that anybody who knows anything about economics would know, I guarantee you 99% of the people couldn't tell you that. And the people on the left do not care because it doesn't serve their purpose. They don't care that this is a proxy of what you have worked hard for. They want to inflate that away for their own power and purpose. So it is very inconvenient for them to understand reality. And that's why he can't explain it.
I think he knows what it is, but can't explain because he doesn't want to take a position on it, because I think they're all in bed with MMT. So he doesn't want to say I'm in bed with MMT because it's insanity. But I think he also doesn't know how to bridge that gap. There's a huge gap between reality and insanity. And
there is.
And I think that's what it is. He just doesn't want to be seen crossing that bridge because there's no sane reason to do it.
No, and the fact of the matter is you had all of these MMT people selling this fantasy, and up until a few years ago, there were a lot of people who bought into the fantasy, although many of us said, no, this is something that stands for reality. You can't just make it up just because you have a checkbook. You can't write unlimited amount of checks. It doesn't work that way. And we have now lived through the worst inflationary period in 40 plus years, and these MMT people have not gotten enough shame. They should be walked through the streets and we should go shame, 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 because it is their BS that they have been selling into the government, into schools, that has allowed this to occur and has allowed this decoupling from reality, because they want to believe in unicorns that, fart rainbows.
Yeah.